right, let's get underway. I'm going to start introductions and then people can continue to file in as we do that. My name is Jacqueline Friedman. I am the founder and executive director of Educate Us. We are the host of this monthly series called No Means No. It's a monthly learning series about things that can help you be a better advocate for sex education and other related issues. And we do a different topic every month. And we appreciate all of you coming and learning with us. I know I always learn something from these as well. What we're going to have tonight, we have two incredible guests from Equimundo who are going to be talking to us about how to help young men resist radicalization and how to support young men along the way, support everyone along the way. But before we do that, just a couple of housekeeping announcements. The first is we'd love for participants, attendees to use the chat to introduce yourselves, share your name. If you're affiliated with an organization, you could share that. You could share where you're zooming in from right now. You could also share any reasons that motivated you to come here tonight. Like why did this feel like an important conversation for you to have? We're not going to mostly be using the chat tonight. We're going to be using the Q&A. Oh, the chat is disabled. We did this last month too. I'm sorry. Hold on. Uh, Attendees can chat. Okay. It should be enabled now. Um, so thank you, both of you, for getting in the Q&A for that. Try the chat now. We're not going to be using the chat for most of the time. But we want to give a chance for you all to connect with each other and know who's in the room. We will be taking your questions, so as you have questions, make sure to put them in the Q&A box and not the chat. We'll not be able to answer questions that you put in the chat. We'll only be able to answer questions that you put in the Q&A box. I hope that is not too confusing. It is so that we can keep things orderly, and so that we give people who may want to disrupt these proceedings for nefarious reasons less opportunity to do so. I think that's it. We're going to hear from Jose and Caroline from Equimundo for a little table setting about the issue of young men, isolation, and radicalization. Then I'm going to get to ask them a few questions myself. I get little host privileges there. And then we're going to open it up to all of your questions and have a larger discussion to make sure that all the things that you want to have addressed tonight, that we get to as many of them as possible. So that said, I want to welcome Jose and Caroline, who work for the wonderful organization Equimundo that's working on issues supporting and concerning men and boys around the world. Jose and Caroline, if I might ask you, since this is an informal setting, to just introduce yourselves and then take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. I think maybe I can get us started. I am José Campi-Portaluppi. I work as Director of Communications and Advocacy for Equimundo, Center for Masculinities and Social Justice. I've been working with the org for over 2 years now, and I started my journey working in Latin America, mostly with women-led organizations and LGBTQI populations. So this side of the spectrum seems like a different side of the same equation. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm a queer brown immigrant at a time when those identities do not necessarily feel very welcome. So I think that it is important to render them visible now more than ever. But yeah, I'll pass it over to Caroline, who I have the privilege of working with on a daily basis.
Hi, everybody. My name is Caroline Hayes. I use she, her pronouns. I am based in Washington, D.C., and have been working at Equimundo for almost 3 years, which is crazy. I work on strategic initiatives, which can sound big, but mostly what I do is spend my time looking at narrative shift, especially in digital spaces and in online environments. And so yeah, I'm kind of nose deep in the manosphere, if you will, and spend a lot of my time thinking about counter narratives and how to combat some of the harmful conversations that are happening in digital ecosystems, but also looking at a lot of the good stuff that's happening. So we're going to talk about some of that today. Really, really grateful for everybody for being with us today. I know it's hard to know where to focus your attention these days. And so we're really lucky and fortunate to have you all spend this time with us in a really hectic moment right now. So with that, maybe we have some slides for you all. And if feel free to take note of questions along the way, and then we'll be happy to answer any questions at the end. So I'm going to share. All right. So we are Equimundo, Center for Masculinities and Social Justice. Today we're going to be talking about a few different things, specifically looking at a population group of young men, boys and young men growing up in kind of the digital landscape of the world today, what's going on in the so-called manosphere. How do we think about it? How do we define it? It's kind of a nebulous term right now, but we think it's useful to kind of break it down for folks in terms of what we're seeing. And then look at how it ties to democracy and the future of gender equality and some of the trends we're seeing around the backlash and backsliding of rights, not just in this country, but around the world. And so we'll be talking about some of our global findings as well. And yeah, and then we'll talk about some solutions. So we'll try and raise the energy a little bit, hopefully, and tell you a little bit more about what we're finding promising these days. So yeah, with that, maybe I'll just turn it over to Jose to talk a little bit about our org and what we do, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Caroline. Yeah, let's hope that we end on a more positive note, though I do apologize because some of the journey is not necessarily going to feel as positive. Just to talk about a little bit about Equimundo, we are an organization that prides itself from being a research-first organization. So everything that we do is evidence-based. But while we start with research, we'd like to say as well that we are advocacy-driven. So while there's a lot of people that do research for the sake of research, in what I tend to identify a bit of like more sociopathic research, we believe that when we identify that there's a problem in society and we see that there's something that is radically wrong, then we decide to try and tackle it and try to design the solutions that will allow us to affect that reality. And when we talk about affecting or designing solutions, those solutions can either come from the programmatic end, so designing interventions, products, or experiences that allow us to engage with men and boys for gender equality, or designing advocacy strategies, understanding advocacy as moving policy, but also, and I think first and foremost, moving people. Because as we see today, and not just here, but in many other spaces around the world, policy can be very easily regress if the people are not there to sustain it. In that sense, and maybe Caroline, next slide, we accompany men and boys throughout their life cycle for gender equality with the understanding that gender equality is good for women, for LGBTQI folk, for gender nonconforming people, but also is good for men themselves, and trying to get men and boys to understand that they also have a stake in gender equality. We start as early as 3 years old with our Global Boyhood Initiative, which aims to affect the spaces in which kids learn to be kids, or where boys learn to be boys. We work with boys, with girls, and with all children in an understanding that the relational component and dynamic is quite key, because boys do not grow up in isolation, hopefully. And then we go towards what we call the Menker campaign, which started as a global fatherhood campaign, but is now transitioned to be called Fatherhood, Caregiving, and Equality, in an acknowledgement of the multidimensional quality of care, passing through the Link Up Lab, which Caroline will speak of in more detail later on as one of the key solutions that we are putting forward. Maybe next slide. To get us started on topic, we are going to try and paint a quick picture of what we are seeing with young men today. A lot of this may sound already very familiar. So we're seeing around the world that men seem to be going backwards in their understanding or in their perception around societal issues and social justice related issues. While at the same time, we are seeing that younger women and gender nonconforming people seem to be pushing forward and demanding for full equality, not now, but yesterday, and rightfully so. We are experiencing at the same time a moment where there seems to be what we identify as a weaponization of young men, that weaponization that is happening by actors that are working around a concerted effort that we call backlash, backsliding of rights, or pushback against rights, and that we are experiencing and seeing in many dimensions around, and in many countries around the globe. Young men seem to be unsure in the face of Me Too, and expressing that they are not necessarily feeling how they should behave, or how the world has seemed to have shifted around them, a shift that we do not think that is for worse, but a shift nonetheless. And there seems to be an underlying currency of economic precarity that is affecting as one of the key variables that is affecting the different dynamics that we are going to be addressing today. So we are trying to ask ourselves, why are we drifting apart? And that will be one of the questions that will continue to resonate in our minds as we continue with this presentation. Maybe next, Caroline. It is very important to address, as we sometimes, when we talk about intersectionality, this is sometimes the variety or the variable that we tend to miss, and it's the variable of class. We are seeing around the US, and this is data from our State of American Men report from 2023. The next edition of this report is going to be coming out later in May or the first weeks of June. But from the one in 2023, we saw that across ethnic groups, men in the US who perceive themselves as economically precarious are more likely to oppose feminism. So there is quite a clear relationship between that sense of economic precarity and their views around feminism and other social justice issues. We see it more and more when you interview or when you talk to people from the middle of the country. We like to talk about the men in the middle, and that men in the middle tends to sometimes in the US also be the men in the geographical middle of the country. And when you approach them and say, for example, try and have a conversation with them about male privilege, and they will say that privilege that you're mentioning is not a privilege that I see in my life. And they're not necessarily seeing it because they're saying that they're working 2 jobs, that they're not identifying a chance of being able to escape their own household, and that they're not seeing that how that American dream that maybe their parents or their grandparents experience, how that applies to them. The next. We're also seeing with these young men coming out of the State of American Men report that traditional manhood provides young men with a sense of purpose in moments of confusion. So those men who report or who identify with the most rigid versions of manhood are identifying or reporting having a clearer sense of purpose, while those men who identify as progressive are saying that they do not necessarily understand what their purpose is in life. This is very much aligned to the formulaic approach that, for example, Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson and some of the radical influencers on the right seem to have, where there seems to be quite a clear path on how to behave and how to conduct themselves. So if you want to be a manly man, you just push your shoulders back, you clean up your room, you work out. While on our end, and this is sort of a mea culpa from the civil society space that we inhabit, there tends to be more of a ethereal approach and more of a nuanced approach on the type of masculinities that we would want to see in the world. So while they're selling quite a clear formula of quite a clear and concise version of what it means to be a guy, we seem to be talking about the potentiality to be everything, and that may have a relationship with that sense of confusion. From our State of American Men report, we're also seeing 45% report trusting a manosphere influencer more than their political leaders. 2/3 of young men are saying that no one really knows me well. 30% haven't talked to anyone outside of their household in the last 2 weeks. And 4 out of 10 of young men from 18 to 23 are reporting to have had experienced suicidal ideation thoughts in the last 2 weeks. And so these are results that are not necessarily very easy to go through, and these are results that created quite a sense of alert. These same young men are saying that they place more value on their online lives than on their offline lives. And so right after hearing this, we went to try and identify how those online lives worked and what they look like. And so I'll pass it along to Caroline to walk us through it, as she is the most online person that I that I know and that I've ever met.
Maybe that you know of that you've ever met, but really thanks so much, Jose, for going over those data points. And we can drop a link in the chat to the State of American Men report, which, as we mentioned, came out in 2023. And that was with about a survey of about over 2,000 men across the US, that was nationally representative across age, race, income, and all the like. So it's a pretty intensive piece of research, and we'll be doing a follow-up this year, actually, with some new data to track kind of the trends over the past few years and how they've been going. So excited to share more about that. But as Jose mentioned, we did we looked at this data in 2023, which feels like so long ago at this point, and saw some of these concerning trends pop up. And we really kind of zeroed in on what was happening with young men specifically, as Jose mentioned, that 18 to 23 age range. And so when we were looking at kind of what could be the influences that young men are, how are they learning about gender these days? How are they learning about masculinities? We decided to do a 6-month deep dive into kind of what types of media and what types of narratives they are consuming about masculinities and gender. And so we found it really important to look at some of these spaces. As you can see, we kind of mapped the contexts that were kind of male specific across in-person spaces in the US. And as you can see, these sort of small little bubbles over here. We have Boy Scouts, gyms that some men are showing up to, US college fraternities, F3 Nation workout groups. That's just a small example of this group called F3. It stands for Faith, Fellowship, and Fitness. And it's a bunch of guys getting together to practice all of those things together. And then we looked at some of the more huge spaces that men are going to, which is many of their online lives. And so we looked at these 6 platforms as kind of key spaces. So this is YouTube, Reddit, Discord, Twitch, TikTok, and fantasy football leagues as kind of interesting places to deep dive into how kind of the most effective ways we could design to meet men where they're at, where they're going to, in order to help them kind of create new masculine narratives or new narratives around what it means to be a man in those spaces and how we could effectively bring them into healthier spaces and be more exposed to positive content. So from that research, we found that men are really consuming a really broad range of topics. Some of those topics can be skill-based, such as gaming, sports, and fitness. Some of them can be DIY, home improvement, and others are around motivation and lifestyle. And a lot of these topics can be kind of entry points into the manosphere, but aren't obviously blanket in the manosphere itself. And so in the background here, you can see some of our social network analysis that we did on YouTube, mapping some of these categories and their sizes and influences. And so what were some of the topics that we found that men were looking into online for more information? They were looking for advice about romantic relationships. They were looking for advice about how to get fit or how to get strong, which others here might know as looks maxing. They're looking for information about success and skill building. So a lot of young men looking for financial advice in the state of economic precarity that many of us live in right now. Looking for information about mental health topics, wanting to vent about feeling rejected or feeling they didn't get the job that they wanted to get. Information about fatherhood, what it means to be a caregiver, which is a really interesting one, and we have found kind of fruitful for redirecting conversations around anger towards healthy notions around masculinity and caregiving. And also topics around sexuality and sex, talking about size differences and talking about the NoFap movement. I don't know if folks have heard about it. I've done a little bit of research on kind of men and their use of porn and how the NoFap movement is really taking off as kind of a way to exercise your masculinity by not masturbating, essentially. And so with all of that, we found that a lot of the content that is being served to young men as they're looking for terms or looking for information about those different topics is really blending what can be actually quite helpful with things that can be actually quite harmful. So, for example, you'll see someone take a young 17-year-old looking for information about how to get rich, and they'll come across a video about crypto and how to invest in crypto. And then alongside that same video, there's also narratives that are quite harmful around, how feminism and LGBTQ people have sort of taken over the system, and you need to work against the system in order to be an independent man. And you can do that through investing in crypto, things like that, where that content is really blended into each other. And it's really hard for young people with a lack of digital literacy skills to be able to parse out what actually serves them and what can be quite harmful. And as I mentioned, here are some of the major categories here that we found as sort of gateways into the manosphere, specifically around some of these different topics. So not all of the lifestyle and sports content you see online is going to be in the manosphere per se, but there are sometimes the way that the algorithm recommender system works is that all of the content that you're seeing on your screen is being captured, like the algorithm wants to feed you content that will keep your eyeballs on the screen as long as possible. And so when there is more sensationalized or extreme content that you're watching, the more the algorithm is going to feed that to you in the recommender system. Hence why something that can be as simple as how to get a date can feed you really sensationalized content about how women have taken over the world and are trying to destroy your life as a man, basically. Um, and so, yeah, some of these topics that come up are like, how do I find love? How to combat loneliness? Women suck. You shouldn't have to beg. You are entitled to it. You deserve it. You are right. I should go out there and do something about it. So those are some of we track a lot of narratives around men and their lives and like the types of searches and information they're looking for. And so what we're trying to do is develop counter narratives to some of these key narratives we're finding in the manosphere in order to better combat some of the harmful information and misinformation that's kind of going around unchecked. And so, as I mentioned, these were some of the topics that we looked at, and some of the kind of key notes to be aware of is how incels, for example, I think many of us on this call are probably aware of kind of the uptick in the incel groups that are kind of capitalizing on searches around romantic and dating advice. In the looks maxing category, there's folks who are advocating for breaking your jaw, basically, in order to make it look more chiseled or more Chad-like. There's also this concept of mewing, which is basically doing tongue and jaw exercises to make your jaw appear more chiseled. Lots of financial scams out there. Take Hustlers University or The Real World, Andrew Tate's kind of multi-level marketing scheme that has really proliferated across the internet. And a lot of the mental health topics that men are looking for offer kind of short-term advice, as Jose mentioned, like making your bed and drinking water in Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. This can be effective in the short term, of course, but some of the narratives around gender and masculinity, our research finds actually leads to negative health outcomes in the long term in men's lives, as well as their peer groups and their communities around them. And so I'll just kind of go through to this last piece, which is looking at we've kind of mapped a playbook for how a lot of these manosphere content creators kind of operate and function and are kind of using the same playbook in order to basically metastasize their narrative across the internet and build actually like quite thriving communities, I would say. I hesitate to use the word thriving. I don't know if that's the right word I want to use, but robust communities, you could say, that really develop strong relationships with the influencers or content creators themselves. And so a few just like key pieces of that. The first step would be finding like a boy in crisis audience. So identifying specific demographics around young men who are disaffected or feeling rejected or isolated in where they are. And then building a community around this victim narrative. So they would construct sort of a compelling narrative framing societal changes as threats to the status identity of men specifically and white men specifically. And then there's sort of a deeper indoctrination or interaction process where the creator might host interactive experiences to deepen the engagement. This can even be like hikes. I've seen, some content creators create like hikes in the woods or, camping out with a group of men that follow them in order to, become your manly self in the wilderness, whatnot. So there's, which again, like not inherently a harmful thing to go on a hiking trip or whatnot with a bunch of friends. But a lot of the undergirded narratives underneath this group formation and this community identity is like quite the antithesis to some of the work that we've been collectively as a sector been trying to push for years. There's certainly a monetization process, and I'm happy to talk about what that looks like in detail. But really key to understand is the way that a lot of the platforms are financially, their profit model works by driving this like sensationalized or extreme content, and the content creators are then financially rewarded for creating more and more of that extreme or sensationalized content. And so it's this mutually reinforcing relationship between the platforms and the creators themselves that's creating this sort of bubble effect. And then lastly is, as we've seen, not but, in the past year, political and social influence that's beyond just sort of the simple, oh, it's just a silly video where my son is laughing about this, stupid comment this content creator makes, but we don't have to take him seriously. This is a coordinated movement that's very much interlocked into political influence that I think has been largely trivialized until the last election in the US. It really come to a head. So yeah, we've been tracking this for a while, but it's been hard to make the connections between sort of the political sort of structure behind some of the content that feels often ignored or trivialized by kind of mainstream media. And so maybe I'll pass back to Jose to just wrap up some of these topics. Or you're muted, but I can also.
Sorry. Yeah,
No,
it's been like 6 years after the pandemic, and that's still happening to me on a daily basis. But thank you, Caroline, for walking us through what some people call the manosphere. Just to say that I've been trying to answer some of the questions in the chat and pasting some links that might be useful, including our State of American Men report, our report on the Manosphere Reward, which is the one that from which Caroline was drawing for this last portion of the presentation, but also a glossary that was put together by some of our partners on some of the key concepts around the manosphere. Someone was asking whether it was what to do if you were maybe coming from a distance to some of these topics. And I think that that glossary can be an interesting introduction to the conversation, but also to offer that if there's anyone that would want to have a more in-depth conversation after the webinar, just please feel free to reach out, and we're always happy to connect and share our learnings. I think one of the things that we've encountered in this journey is that we've been able to grow and learn quite a bit just because of the sheer generosity of people in the online community and doing this work. So I think it's crucial for us to pay it forward. Going back to young men today, we are seeing that young men are lonely. Therefore, we are identifying what we call a crisis of connection that seems to be affecting young men. That a lot of the interactions that they are engaging with or that are prompting them to engage with online spaces have to do with that quest for better connections, whether that's finding love, whether that's making friends, whether that's finding someone that shares your interests and trying to build a sense of community, a sense of community or a quest for connection that is being exploited by a few folks online. There is that underlying sense of economic precarity that is affecting these young men and that is affecting the way in which they navigate the world, not just the physical, but the online one. There are those who have been saying, we care about you. And we say seem to care between quotations because there's been these nefarious actors that have been saying, I hear you, I see you, I feel you, your pain is real. And while we agree very much with those people in the symptoms that we are seeing with these young men, we disagree vehemently about the causes and the solutions to the problems that we are experiencing. So while they say the cause for these problems are all of these minorities around that are coming into this country, that are women, that are LGBTQI folk, we vehemently disagree that the problems that they are experiencing are caused by those minorities. If there was a minority to be suggested, I've been saying for quite a bit, quoting from Laverne Cox, that there's a billionaire minority that may be at more fault than any of the others. We are seeing young men who seem to be very unsure of their stake in gender equality and young men who seem to be scared. Why should we care about all of this? We come from a place of empathy. So we say we care about this because we want everyone to be okay. But we also care about this because these men who are scared, these men who are experiencing this crisis of connection are very much likely to then go and exercise anger or exercise or project their fear on those who they have around them. And as I said before, when we were talking about where boys grow up in an ecosystem where there's girls, boys grow up in an ecosystem where there's gender nonconforming folk, boys grow up in an ecosystem where there's other minorities and other boys. Men exist within those same environments. So all of us are sharing this planet. And if those people go out there and exercise those anxieties and fears on their shoulders or in the lives of others, then we all end up suffering. When we talk about what to do in the face of this reality, one of the things that we are saying is maybe we need to start adapting or reflecting on the way in which we've been framing some conversations. Historically, on our end, we've been pushing for the concept of allyship with quite a lot of effort into the world, talking about male allyship at the workplace, talking about allyship for women, talking about allyship for LGBTQI rights. But we acknowledge that that message of allyship doesn't seem to resonate with everyone in the same way. I was raised by a crazy feminist mother and her tribe of friends in South America. And we were taught from a very early on that if you wanted someone to show for your protest, you needed to show up for theirs. So if tomorrow someone says to me, hey, there's a march for the rights of the Rohingya people, I'm going to be one of the first people holding up my sign in that space. But I also understand that for the conversations that we've been having with younger men, a lot of them feel that that concept of allyship makes them feel or instrumentalized for the benefit of others. So a lot of them are asking, okay, if I care about these people and if I care about these people, but then who cares about me? So what we're trying to say is not ditch the concept of allyship, but rather adapt depending on who is the audience that we're engaging with, who are the people that we are engaging in a conversation with. So if we're talking to those people who feel instrumentalized by the concept of allyship, then maybe frame the conversation with them around their own stake in gender equality until we can get them to understand the concept of allyship or make it so that allyship resonates with them. Maybe Caroline can explain a bit more about that,
Yeah,
what we call this allyship spectrum.
I'll try to keep it tight just to close this out here, but basically we're just looking at different methodologies to shift folks, do a bit of segmentation by kind of by different audiences across the spectrum of allyship, if you will. This has been used as a model. So folks who might be more neutral in terms of being on board with gender equality might actually respond better to different messages or certain messengers that might actually move them closer to passive allies, and then in that audience group then be brought into the active allies column. But it takes a little bit of deep strategizing and understanding in order to be able to make the messages resonate with different folks. And so we have some strategies to do that. I'll just float this as a lead into the conversation, but we're working with a group called Futures Without Violence to build out, it's called the Link Up Lab. It creates digital solutions for healthy masculinities online. Happy to share more about this, but for the most part, we're looking to incubate new solutions in some of these digital platforms, evaluate it and iterate on it, accelerate what works, and then scale to national and potentially global levels of influence, as most of our programs have been sort of small group-based education interventions. We're trying to really think about scale in a different way in some of these ecosystems. So with that, I will pause. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, and we're happy to provide more specifics, links to resources, that sort of thing. But we'll pass the floor back over to Jacqueline and Candace.
And we are going to pass the floor to our participants, our attendees, because there's a lot of good questions. I do want to ask one of my own. I'm going to keep it tight for host privilege. But I just wonder what you've learned, if anything, about how we outcompete, right? Like, we know that the answer is to make it possible for young men to find connection in healthier ways, build healthier relationships, build lives outside their, online. But it's so compelling to be on your phone and in this stuff that tells you you don't have to change anything about yourself. You don't have to be uncomfortable. You don't have to be vulnerable. All the problems are with other people. It's such a compelling argument presented in such a compelling and literally gamified and addicting way. Like, do we know anything yet about what kinds of approaches to getting those young men to build other skills and other kinds of relationships? How do we outcompete?
Okay, yeah, I'll there's so many questions unanswered. It's such a good question, but we're actively trying to solve for that. But I'll say a little bit more about some of the narrative shift evaluation that we're doing right now. So we're building out a partnership with a group called Harmony Labs, and what we're doing is, as I mentioned, yeah, audience segmentation, basically to figure out kind of what are the subgroups of audiences online, what are their feeds look like, what are their value systems in terms of what they're watching. And then we'll actually be building out sort of a content continuum that really reflects sort of that allyship scale that we're looking at in a more like granular way. So looking at sort of how can we trace the journey and the feeds of our key audiences across this spectrum, as well as kind of the different types of content they like to engage with and how it maps onto each other. And then what we'll be doing is testing different messages and messengers against some of those different subgroups of audiences to say, okay, if we feed you, content or messages that might be like more aligned with Equimundo's messaging, is this actually going to push you farther away from where we want you to go in the like narrative direction that we're hoping you to move towards, or is this going to bring you closer based on kind of these elements of your audience type? And so we'll be working on that over the next year to figure out kind of what messages, messengers, and spaces work best in order to grow certain elements of the narrative that we want to place in certain areas. And with that, we think we can better understand actually, is there certain language or iconography or ways of framing things that actually might be incentivizing greater backlash because sort of these consolidated actors are really good at like counter narrativing us. And so
Yeah.
yeah, it's a work in progress to like understand this at scale, because I think a lot of Equimundo's history, we've just been like putting things out that make sense in the context of like gender equality sector and academia and sort of civil society that like sound good to us, but might not necessarily sound good to the actual audience of folks that we actually want to influence and work with. So yeah, we'll be doing some of that.
If I could ask one of you to drop in the chat if somebody wanted to sign up for your email list or want to
Sure.
know when that research comes out. I imagine there's a lot of people here who are going to want to hear about that. Like the best way for people to sign up to hear about that research as it's developed, if you could put that in the chat, that would be great.
We will. And just to add maybe, Jacqueline, two things to what Caroline was mentioning is
Yeah.
that how do we compete, I think, is for us not to discard everything that this other people seem to be doing, but rather what are the learnings that we can take from their work. We've seen, and Caroline has flagged this to me many, many times, like that there seems to be a cooperative spirit on this, on that side of the world. And so there's a lot of cross-pollination. Influencers seem to be percolating and jumping from one channel to the other. They seem to be amplifying each other's reach. They seem to be working around this concerted effort with quite a great deal of organization. And so I think that the basic response or the most natural response would be for us to organize as well, for us to work in what like they seem to be having a weird spirit of sorority that maybe we haven't had. So the idea is, how do we build this community and build a concerted effort of our own to be able to push against their pushback?
And I would add to that, I mean, part of the answer is that they don't have scarcity. There's a lot of funding on the right for content creators that are pushing right-wing ideas. And so it's easier for them to collab because they're not fighting for every click, right? Because they have stable funding. And I don't know if there's funders in the room right now, but they might watch this on YouTube. So I just want to put that out there that we need to be investing.
Yep.
I want to get to some questions because we have so many great questions. Bruce King asks, where does anti-intellectualism fit into this conversation? It seems many of the influences appear to and present research, but the actual discourse is at odds with many of the dominant values. Non-critical critical thinking. So it passes, this is the Joe Rogan thing, right? It passes for critical thinking. Like, oh, we have this science, but like if you scratch the surface of the science, it's like profoundly anti-intellectual.
Mm.
So can either of you speak to the role of anti-intellectualism in the manosphere?
I have a few thoughts on that. It's a really interesting question. I would say that a lot of the manosphere, actually, I'm glad Jose posted the glossary in there. There's a lot of sort of like pseudoscience that's really latched onto in many of these manosphere creators, communities. There's, for example, I'll give one example, and the concept is called hypergamy. So I don't know if folks have heard about it, but it's essentially this idea that women are always going to select for a mate or a partner that has more resources or is better looking in order to basically maximize their ability to procreate. And so it's essentially this argument that like men have to be able to be the better protector, provider, or 1% man in order to attract the most high value women on the sexual marketplace. And I'm using all terminology from the manosphere, so I'm sorry if it sounds weird, but it's like,
Air quotes, yes.
yeah.
Not enough air quotes in the world.
Yeah. And so this, again, this is sort of like this pseudoscience that there's maybe a few research articles that are really iffy, that are sort of like light reference, and then they don't actually dive into sort of the methodology behind what any of this means. And so it's really just taken up in sort of these short form video clips that no one actually deep researches in a way that has any empirical evidence behind it. And so I think the like interesting narrative, in one of the major interesting narratives in the ministry, is like, do your own research. Like, don't
Right.
believe what they're telling you. And so the key kind of overarching umbrella narrative that we've been diving into is the system is rigged against you. And so the system has been flipped to be like women and LGBTQ people who like who are, you know, the source of all of your insecurities and vulnerabilities right now. And so you have to like work against the system in order to um, basically survive or function in this world. And so one of those things is like, it's the red pill philosophy, right? It's like this system has lied to you. You need to do your own research in order to understand the world around you and be, you know, Neo in the Matrix or whatever. And so that works really, that kind of that narrative works really well to kind of tap into young men's sort of like countercultural, or any teenagers sort of like countercultural, rebellious um, energy that often has been relevant across time and space. But yeah, so those are just a few thoughts of things that I've been noticing. There's a lot of other examples to provide around sort of the pseudoscience that pilfers through manosphere rhetoric.
So here's a really core, this sort of is the boiled down question, right? Like, how do you even begin to draw young men out of their rooms in order to begin the conversation? I mean, that is, I think the conversation, that's the question that's on everybody's hearts, right?
I think it seems like a very complicated question, but the answer that we're finding is quite an easy one, and it's that you don't really need to get them out of the rooms at first. And what we're trying to do from the work that we're designing with this innovation lab or link up lab for healthier online masculinity is to try to meet young boys and to meet men where they're at. So what we are doing is digital solutions to meet them online. If they're placing more value in those online spaces, then we're designing interventions that will bring us to the spaces that they're occupying, rather than the traditional approach of wanting them to come to our group training or to the spaces that where we would be. So, for example, we were just today in a meeting with Caroline with the game designer for Roblox. If any of you has a kid, knows what Roblox is highly addictive. There's like 80 million active users on any given day, all of them very young kids. And so one of the things that we're starting to do is designing video games or the mini games experiences within those spaces in order to be able to reach out to the kids with more positive messaging. So while ideally we would like them to live in a world where they would be able to form social bonds and relations outside of the screens, we need to take it step by step. And so while we are also trying to design what those off ramps would be to better offline connection, at the same time, we're saying if they're already here, let's use the power of online gaming in order to be able to tap that. There's already some really cool content out there that has, for example, in the case of online gaming, that leverages that idea of cooperative playing to force kids to play with other kids so that the game will not be just the console and themselves, but rather that makes them build a relationship with someone else that then will allow them to solve quests or to be able to fix the problems that they identify in the games. We've been looking at with Caroline at a couple of games. One is called Unravel 2, where there's this ball, like this doll made out of yarn that starts the game and has to connect his yarn to someone else's yarn, and then together they need to advance throughout the world that they are faced with in order to be able to beat the game. And the whole game was designed by a gaming studio with the premise of saying, how do we build an experience that will prompt kids to try and find better connections? There's another game called It Takes Two that explores relationships. It starts with a kid who sees her parents wanting to fighting and struggling and potentially getting divorced. And then the parents wake up as dolls the next day. And the game has cooperative, like it forces cooperative mode so that you will have to play with someone else in order to solve your marital issues and to be able to advance in the story. So the idea is there's already cool resources that are out there. We just need to get more eyeballs in front of them.
Okay, I want to stack up a couple of questions here because there's a very natural follow-up question here about Link Up Lab. which is about like how are you navigating digital spaces that are controlled by external groups that aren't really regulated. I think we're all seeing what's happening with Twitter and TikTok and Meta, and like, you know, a lot of these spaces are controlled by groups that don't necessarily align with the goals of the folks in this room. And then after that, there's multiple questions in here about addressing um, men who are racial or ethnic minorities or trans or other types of minoritized men. There's several versions of that question I'm seeing in the Q&A. So if you could do the follow-up question first, but I want to make sure that the folks who have the question about minoritized men also know that their answer is coming.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the question about the Link Up Lab and kind of working with digital platforms that might have goals that are actually antithetical to some of the worlds that we would envision. So happy to take that one. And then I have a few thoughts on specifically some research we've done interviewing trans men. And just to note that in our State of American Men, the survey is nationally representative. So there is like we have quotas for each of the different groups of population. So trans men were like accounted for as a part of that survey. So it's certainly taken into account in the research that we do. And so I can talk a little bit about that in a second. But to answer the first question, so yeah, I think it's such a important note and question, but I think what we're seeing kind of through most of our work is that digital technologies, and even now we're seeing the conversation around AI is going to like power everything that we do in all of the sectors that we live in. There will be kind of an integration. It already is integrated into all of our lives almost seamlessly or invisibly, whether we like it or not. And so the way that we work and play and interact is inherently changing. And so if we want to be able to better understand sort of the trends that are happening in people's lives and not continue to live in a world that existed 20 years ago, we have to be able to keep up with what those trends are and actually meet people where they are, finding community and connection. And so two different tracks that goes. One is there's a lot of amazing creators and folks in digital spaces who are doing this work already and just don't have tools, support, resources to be able to scale or grow what they're already doing amazingly. One example I'll give is a Twitch streamer. His name is Aaron Sonicit. He goes by Sonicit on Twitch. He's a big gamer, and he was in these gaming communities that had really bad harassment on Discord and in the spaces he was in playing games. And so he decided to create his own Twitch community, basically to make it a space where people could talk about mental health while they were gaming and watching him game. And what he does before he streams, he does like a 20-minute vent sesh at the beginning, or like cool down sesh, where he'll just stream like a Japanese train, just like go flying through through the earth, and then he'll just have people like decompress and download and vent while this train is going, and then he'll start the game. And so he has really cool moderators that he works with who we interviewed. And so one of those strategies is actually working with mods on Reddit and Discord who are already they call themselves the volunteer janitors of the internet. And they're already doing amazing work trying to make healthier communities, but often the tools that they have are mostly for like banning people or kicking people out. And we want to actually reverse that and incentivize positive behavior change in these communities. So that's one example. There's a lot of other details to give about working in gaming spaces. There's actually a huge business case to be made. Not that I like making business cases for everything, but there's a business case to be made about working with gaming companies. We've had some really positive conversations with some major game companies about actually incentivizing pro-social behavior in game design rather than, as Jose mentioned, like Unravel 2 and It Takes Two already have sort of like collaborative features in the game design. And how can we like basically use those as building blocks to create more healthy games that actually shows evidence-based impact on gamers' behavior and interactions with each other. So, obviously imperfect world of the digital kind of billionaires that are controlling us all. But we're trying to work with like the world that we exist in and design solutions that can be an immediate positive for people around them while not trying to like cross our fingers for legislative or policy change that obviously needs to happen. So that's just one response to that. And then yeah, I don't want to talk too long. Jose, if you want to add in.
Yeah, so
Nothing that I could say better than you.
the overall question next is just sort of how are these dynamics that we've been describing different for racial and ethnic minorities and also sexual and gender minority men?
Well, I'd say that with anything in life, there seems to be clear distinctions of those variables and how those intersecting identities will affect the lived experience of the people that are on the other end. But in all honesty, the research that we've conducted doesn't necessarily or hasn't necessarily been analyzed that way yet. We are expecting that for the next version of the State of American Men in 2025, we're more able to provide that answer. We've started to also conduct qualitative focus groups with different sets of young men in the States. We just came out from an experience in Kansas City talking to especially Latino minorities in the US. We're also conducting research with Latino fathers in the US in order to be able to understand what those particularities mean for their lived experience around these topics. But the idea is, or the honest answer is, we don't know. We are still in the process of trying to figure it out.
I would just add, I just linked in the chat. There's a commentary that just came out after the release of Adolescence, highlighting some research from the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, or ISD, and they found that 1 in 5 young people between the ages of 16 and 24 have a positive view of Tate, and this is actually increasing for ethnic minorities. Those from racial
Mm,
minority backgrounds were more likely to view Tate as positive, with 41% of Black respondents and 31% of Asian respondents and 15% of white respondents saying that they had a positive view of Andrew Tate. So there's a lot to unpack there. I think we can do, some without having sort of like qualitative data or research under my arm right now. There's a lot to think about the ways that economic precarity is leading to high rates of agreement with sort of like harmful norms around masculinity. And when you experience vulnerabilities or further marginalization in like very rigid power structure, you're going to want to like accumulate power however possible, or sometimes like overcompensate for things spaces
mm,
in ways that you might not be able to get power in other parts of your life. So, and there's also just a survival tactic that comes with like adhering to certain norms around masculinity. Like if you present as too feminine or queer, like you literally could have your life threatened. And so there's actually like defense and coping mechanism to adopting and adhering to some of these like traditional or like harmful norms around masculinity. So there's so much nuance there in some ways that I don't think quantitative data always fully unpacks really well. But I would point
mm.
folks to this book called Cool Pose, um, which is written by an author. This is like actually kind of a long time ago. It's called Cool Pose: The Dilemmas of Black Manhood in America by Richard Majors. It came out in 1992, so a while ago. But there's really interesting analyses and much research has been done then around kind of this really nuanced and complicated phenomena that exist within these intersecting identities. So that would just be my addition to that conversation.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. I hope we can touch on both of them. And I'm gonna ask them in order so we can close on the big juicy takeaway question. So Charles says that he doesn't see a lot of male leaders stating a clear case to young men that their lives can be better if they build real relationships of equality and sharing with other genders, and that equality and sharing is not a charitable act, but a common goal that benefits everyone, but doesn't see that frame from men a lot. And would love to hear a little discussion of that. And then the final question I'd like you all to answer to close us out is do you have advice about actions that the folks here tonight can be taking to contribute? Like what should folks leave here and think about doing in their own lives, in their own professional lives, but also in their own personal lives?
I can maybe take the first one. I don't think there's much to be said, but rather than to say that I really agree with Charles that we need to get more men and more people reframing the conversation and willing to do so out there. That the idea that we continue to bang the same drum in the same way that we've been doing and waiting to get different results is not necessarily the most conducive way forward, and that we should be able to make the case on why gender equality is good and is good for everyone. And I think that sometimes we struggle at making that case because we've been framing it on one side of the equation for a very long time and not really caring about the benefits for everyone else. Well, while we say that they're there, we haven't necessarily explored on what that unpacking really is. And so through the work that we're doing, for example, with the Global Boyhood Initiative, which is the campaign that on Equimundo's side that focuses with boys as early as 3, there has been a big challenge for us in how do we make it so that people understand that what we need to do is not to, and I don't know, like for example, when we get a lot of people saying, hey, how do I teach a boy to be caring? That just explaining that the work is not about teaching boys to be caring, but rather just by allowing them to continue to be their caring selves. So the work that we do is mostly with adults, saying, hey, let's not break these children who already came out wired to care and who already came out ready to be that. But I do think that the challenge is, how do you explain to others what the actual benefits of it is? If you were raised as a boy, you understand what the consequences of being raised as a boy were. From where I come from in Ecuador, all of the conversations where boys do not cry, boys do not express their emotions, boys are not to be a part of this conversation. If you have a dad or a grandfather, they wouldn't hug you. They would just tap you in the back or tap you in the head and say, go along and just stop crying and just brace yourself and continue enduring through life. And we all see the consequences later on in life for us to be able to express the emotions. We, like people like me, spend the rest of our lives trying to deconstruct and trying to unlearn all of those horrible things that we learned and that didn't come from the people that didn't like us, but actually came from the people who loved us. And so I do think that if we frame it in that way, if we emphasize that we're as men literally dying earlier because of those rigid versions of masculinity, I think that can go a long way.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on what to do next and a lot of big creative ideas. But if anything, I think we take our inspiration a lot at Equimundo from the folks who are doing amazing work in some of these digital ecosystems without any support and are doing this, volunteering their time to create this content and create these spaces for people to thrive. So our strategy is just to figure out actually what tools and systems are needed to do the amazing work they're already doing, and saying we're coming to this late, from the NGO sector. You're already up with the times, you know how to work and function in these spaces. What can we learn from you? So we interviewed content creators, moderators, game designers in order to be able to better understand how we adapt our programming strategy and our work to the realities of where people are finding connection today. And the other thing I'll mention is just there's so much room for effective counter narratives that actually speak to the lived interests and realities of young men themselves. And the best example I have right now off the top of my head is Elon Musk, and a lot of folks in sort of the NGO civil society sector saying he's bad for democracy, he's ruining democracy. That works with a certain group of people who know what democracy actually affords them and knows what the meaning of democracy is. I don't think it's quite difficult to define it for many people in the US and around the world. But I would say one amazing trend that happened is it was revealed that Elon Musk cheats in video games, and there's this Twitch streamer and YouTuber. His name is Charlie, or Moist Critical, or Penguin Zero on YouTube, and he made this entire breakdown of how it was impossible for Elon Musk to be as good as he said he was, or in the top 20 players, and I forget the video game off the top of my head, but that was millions and millions of hits, and there were really interesting data points around how that was actually shifting attitudes and perspectives around Elon Musk, around young men themselves. So we have to get creative about what messages actually resonate with young men. And the idea that a guy cheats in video games, and the way that, and the breakdown they give, is very easily transferable to how he's cheating us over as a society and the government. So just that's my one example to give of let's break out of our let's break out of our normal thought patterns and think creatively and differently about how to reach different audiences outside of the scope of who we normally reach.
And maybe to add to that, to those people here in the call that have children, I've seen a couple of messages of moms that are out there. I've encountered especially in the last month, people in the different gatherings around the world that will come to me and say, hey, I am a feminist, I have a son, and I've raised him well, but he spends a lot of time on his phone, and I prefer not to watch and I prefer not to ask what he's doing because I'd rather not know. And I do think that what we should encourage is for more people to sit down and game with their kids, for more people to sit down and have those difficult conversations, for more people to do the bravest thing or the scariest thing, which is to try and figure out what is happening on the other side of those windows that every kid has in their pockets nowadays, and to have difficult conversations. They're never fun, but I do think that they can make a ton of difference when we venture and wonder what is the adventure of boyhood that is happening on the other side of those devices.
And I will add to that, actually, if I may, like, this is a preview of what we'll be doing for our No Means No session next month, but there is a lot of research that shows in general, not just about men and boys, that when you get curious about people, when you ask them to tell you stories about what's going on and what they value, and they feel really listened to, it really opens up a channel where you can really connect and then possibly persuade them to move through some bias and fear that they're stuck in. And we'll be talking about having how to have those conversations in a general sense as our April No Means No. I don't have a date for you yet, but that will be coming out soon. So that aligns completely with the work that we do here at Educate Us, which is that the fundamental unit of connection is curiosity.
Love that word. It's one of my favorites.
Um,
Should we
yeah,
drop our
Caroline, do you want to
email?
tell
I
you
just
how?
want to say thank you. This was amazing. It's so good to be with all of you. Thanks for joining us on a Monday. And we'll drop our emails in the chat or have them shared. And we'd be really happy to follow up with anyone's questions on details around any of the projects or work we have planned. This obviously just scratches the surface of some of the stuff we're doing. But yeah, we just really are grateful for people's interest and time.
Well, we're incredibly grateful for the two of you to spend your time with us tonight and for all of the work that you're doing. And we hope to get to continue to work with you because we just think the work you're doing is so incredibly important. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jacqueline. Thank you, Candace. And thank you, Carolyn.
Bye.
Bye.